David was the youngest son of a farmer or shepherd living in Bethlehem. He was from the tribe of Judah. Bethlehem is about 5 miles from Jerusalem. Actually, it's very close to the border of Judah and Benjamin. And he was the youngest son. And from the description we have from him in the Bible and also from Spirit of Prophecy, he was probably not the tallest or the most robust of the sons of Jesse. And if you remember the story, Samuel was called or directed by God to visit Bethlehem, to visit Jesse, and God told him he would point out the successor of Saul. And when Samuel went there, he was introduced to the sons of Jesse, starting with the oldest. And all of the sons of Jesse were impressive. They were strong and handsome. They looked to be in good physical condition. And Samuel, when he laid his eyes upon them, one after another, he kept expecting God to say, "This is the one." But first, second, third, fourth, all the way down, 6 sons. And none of them were the ones that God had selected. And so finally, he turned to Jesse and said, "Do you have any other sons?" And he said, "Well, yes, the youngest. He's tending sheep. He's out in the fields. We didn't think it was necessary for him to come to this celebration, to this dinner, in honor of the prophet." And so Samuel demanded that he be called, and he was brought in. And the Lord revealed that he was the man. And so, taking David aside, Samuel anointed him and told him that he was chosen by God for greatness. Now, at this point, we don't know if Samuel completely revealed to David what that greatness would be. But from that point, the Holy Spirit filled David, and he became an instrument for God. Now, we don't have time today to talk about every single aspect of David's life, but from that point, a change came over David, and he began to do great things. First, just locally, protecting his flocks and herds from predators. But he was summoned to the court of the king. Now, David was not the oldest or the biggest or strongest, and he was still considered a boy at that time, so he was probably under 20 years old. We don't know his exact age. But the reason he was called to Saul's service was Saul was experiencing depression, and he was experiencing mood swings, and he wanted a harpist, he wanted a musician, someone who could come in and play and soothe him when he was undergoing these bouts of black moods. And so David was recommended to him for this. He was already known and renowned for his musical talents. And so when Saul was experiencing these bad moods, David would play, and his music would soothe the king's spirit. And so this was David's introduction to life beyond Bethlehem. It was serving as a singer and as a musician in the courts of Saul. He did not do that on a continual basis. He was called from time to time. And between his periods of service, he returned and continued working as a shepherd with his father, under his father's directions. Israel went to war. The Philistines attacked, and the army was called out. And his older brothers went to serve in the army under Saul. And the Philistines and the Israelites, they met in a valley. And one army camped on one side of the valley on the high ground, and the other army camped on the other side of the valley on the high ground. And between them was the valley and a stream or a brook. And neither side was willing to take the initiative and attack the other, because the high ground was a very defensible position. And even the Philistines, with their better weapons, with their chariots, their horses, the ground was not suitable for this kind of combat, and they were not that excited about rushing uphill in their heavy armor to engage the Israelites. And so the two armies simply camped and watched each other. And time passed, and Jesse sent his son David to take some supplies to the family, to his brothers that were in the army. And so David took the food and he went to the camp. He met his brothers. And while he was there, he witnessed something. The Philistines had a champion. His name was Goliath. And Goliath was a giant. He was one of the survivors of the giant clans. Most of them had died, but there were still a few of them around. And some of them were in Gath. Goliath and his brothers, he had I think 4 or 5 brothers, and they were all giants. And Goliath, with his armor bearer, his shield bearer, every morning he would come out, and every evening he would come out, and he would challenge Israelites to combat. Come down and fight. You are dogs. And he insulted them, he insulted their king, and he insulted their God every day. And day after day, the Israelites looked down at this guy, this giant, and trembled. None of them wanted to tangle with Goliath. None of them were willing to go out and face this man. And even the king, Saul, who was bigger and taller than most of the people, and his sons, Jonathan, even they were unwilling to risk their lives against this Philistine champion who was insulting everything about them. And when David heard Goliath and saw him, he was filled with indignation, righteous indignation. He was angry, and he was moved by the Spirit of God to respond to this challenge. And he asked his brothers, "Why won't anyone go out?" He said, "I will go out." And his brothers were not that happy to hear that. I mean, any of you have younger brothers or sisters? You know, little brothers, little sisters, they can be annoying sometimes, right? You know, they think they know everything, right? They're often spoiled by the parents, so the youngest receives special attention. And the older brothers, they were not happy with David. They accused him of just being a glory seeker and being crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't embarrass us in front of the army. You know, you say you would go out there, but really you can't. It would be crazy for you to do so. And if you went out there, you would just be an embarrassment to us and to our family. Don't make us look bad before the army. Don't make us look bad before the king. But David insisted, and so he was taken before Saul, and he repeated his intention to go out and fight. He did not ask permission. He did not ask Saul, you know, is it okay? He said, I am going to go out there. I am going to deal with this guy. And of course Saul had met David before, and he was impressed and also a little embarrassed by David's zeal. And he offered David his armor. He said, okay, if you want to go out, at least let me give you my armor and my weapons. You can carry those as an honor for me, and also it'll give you some chance against this giant. You know, you have nothing. You know, you're just a shepherd boy. And David did try them on. He tried on Saul's armor. He picked up his weapons, but David was not a trained soldier. He had no experience with wearing armor and using a shield, and he was not familiar with swords. And after trying them on, he politely thanked the king but said, "This is not for me." He said, I can't use this. I'm not familiar with it. It's too big, it's too heavy, and I'm going to rely on what I know. And so David went out and he faced Goliath with his shepherd's staff and his sling, and he picked up several stones from the brook as he went across, and as you know the story, he challenged Goliath in the name of God. And shot one stone, hit Goliath in the forehead. Goliath fell stunned. David went over, cut off his head with Goliath's own sword, and the armies were both very surprised by what happened. And surprise turned to panic on the part of the Philistines. And the Israelites, encouraged by what David did, swept down the valley and up the other side, and the Philistines fled before the Israelites. God gave a great victory because of David's faith and because of his acting on that faith, taking the initiative, going forward, believing that God would be with him. And so this was the beginning of a new stage in David's life. After his great victory, he was, of course, the hero of the day, the hero of the battle. And Saul took him into permanent service as one of his retainers. And David became a soldier, and within a short time he became an officer. He was very successful. God was with him. As Saul gave him tasks, he performed them, and he rose higher and higher until he was one of Saul's generals serving the king. And also during this time, he became close friends with the crown prince, Jonathan. Jonathan was Saul's oldest son, and he and David became very, very close friends, the closest of friends, the best of friends. And also during this time of his life, Saul offered him a daughter in marriage. And at first, David refused. And so that daughter was married to another. And later, Saul's younger daughter took an interest in David, and David took an interest in her. And so David approached the king about marrying this daughter, Michal. And Saul was happy to do that, but by this time there was a little bit of, well, not a little bit, there was a lot of animosity towards David on Saul's part. Saul was a very jealous king. And David, in his success, was drawing more and more adulation of the army and of the people, and even of his own sons. Everyone liked David. And of course, the very famous or infamous song that was being sung, "Oh, Saul has slain his thousands." And Saul liked that. But the next standard he did not like. And David his tens of thousands, right? Saul did not like being compared to David because David was making him look bad. And Saul became more and more jealous of David, and he was trying to think of ways to get rid of him. He sent him on dangerous missions, and David survived and prospered and was successful and defeated the enemies that Saul laid out. And so when David wanted to marry Michal, again Saul used this opportunity to set up a task. Well, you know, if you slay 50 Philistines and bring me proof of their death, then I will accept you as my son-in-law. And David brought back, I think, 100, like twice as many as Saul required. And so he married Michal. But the evil spirit that had come into Saul became stronger and stronger, fed by this anger and this jealousy and animosity towards David. And reaching the point where Saul tried to kill David in front of everybody in the court. He threw a javelin at David and tried to pin him to the wall. And David fled from Saul's presence. And from being a hero in general, he became an outlaw and a runaway. He escaped Saul, and he met with Jonathan one last time. And Jonathan tried to intercede with his father, and Saul threw a javelin at his own son in his anger. And so at this point, David realized there was no chance of forgiveness, there was no chance of coming back into service of Saul, and he had to flee. And so he ran from one place to another. First, he went to the city of Shiloh, the town or village of Shiloh, and he got some supplies from the priest. And from there, he went south into the lands of Judah and into the deserts south of Judah. And there gradually gathered people around him, other men who had run afoul of the king, other supporters of David, people who were loyal to him. Later his family came and joined him in his exile in the desert. And for a number of years, David lived on the run. Saul would go out and hunt for him, and time and again, God rescued David from Saul's attempts. And on several occasions, Saul was placed in David's hands. And in each opportunity, David spared Saul's life and witnessed to the fact that he was loyal and he was not attempting to replace the king. And in each of these instances, Saul would have a change of heart and recognize that David really had no intentions against him. But then time would pass, and Saul again would raise his hands against David out of his jealousy. And this continued for a number of years, up until the time that the Philistines finally invaded Israel again. And then Saul had to turn away from his pursuits of David. But David, he was tired of running. He was constantly having to move around. And even in Judah, the men of Judah had betrayed him on one or two occasions. And so David, doubting God and his protection, left the land of Israel, and he went to the land of the Philistines. He thought, in the land of our enemies, I can find safety. Saul cannot pursue me into our enemies' lands. And so he went to the land of the Philistines, and he applied for asylum. He told them about what had happened to him. You know, the king, I'm the most wanted man in Israel. I have no safety anywhere. And the Philistines, of course, they were very, very suspicious because, you know, David had killed thousands of them, right? He had been very successful in wars against the Philistines, and they thought he was some sort of a spy. But doing a little bit of checking, they realized that David was actually what he said. And so they granted him a small village in the outskirts of the deserts. It wasn't prime land. It was a place that nobody else wanted to live. It bordered the desert. It was an area raided by the tribes from the deserts. And so they gave David this little outpost and said, okay, you and your families and men can live here. And the Philistines expected that from this place David would raid into Judah and in support of their wars. And David did raid, but he did not raid Judah. He raided the desert tribes. But he wasn't honest with the Philistines. He claimed that he was fighting the tribes of Judah. And so for a while, David and his men and their families had a bit of peace as they were living there in Ziklag. But then the war was declared against Israel. The armies gathered, and David was called to serve under the Philistines by the king that he was pledged to. And when the Philistine army gathered, when the 5 kings gathered at one place for their joint army against Israel, David was there. But he was not welcome. The other 4 kings, the other 4 Philistine kings said, this guy is not going to be in our army. You know, once before we had some Israelites who fought with us against the Israelites, but then when the battle turned, they turned. They switched sides. And David, you know, he's been very successful against us in the past. And if there should be a critical point in the battle where the battle is hanging in the balance, David might switch sides as a way of getting back into favor with Saul. We can't afford that. And so, thankfully for David, he was sent home. The king who he was serving under said, you know, I believe you and I trust you and I would have you fight with me, but the other 4 kings won't accept you. So you'll have to go home. And so David returned to Ziklag, and he missed the great battle between the Philistines and the Israelites, in which Saul, Jonathan, and his other oldest sons all died. The Philistine army was victorious, the army of Israel scattered, and David found out about that once he got back to Ziklag. And of course at Ziklag, while he was gone, the village had been raided, and his family and wives and children of his men had been taken away as well. And it was actually on their return from capturing and recapturing these their wives and family that they found out about the death of Saul and Jonathan. And the man who brought the news was an Amalekite, and he thought that he would receive a reward by claiming to have killed Saul and brought David the crown and bracers of Saul. But even at that point, David was not pleased to hear of the death of Saul. And he ordered the execution of this man, this traitor, this Amalekite, who had deserted and claimed to have killed Saul. Of course, Saul had actually not been killed by the Amalekite. He had committed suicide. But this Amalekite claimed that, hoping to receive special praise and honor from David. And so, with the death of Saul, the kingdom plunged into chaos. There were those who supported David and called for David to come back and take the throne. And the men of Judah did crown David as king. But the northern kingdoms, who were under the house of Saul, they were not ready to swear allegiance to David. And instead, Abner, who was the uncle of Saul and who survived the battle, brought one of Saul's younger sons, who was a cripple, and put him on the throne. And so Mephibosheth and David were at war. There was a civil war which lasted for about 10 years. And at the end of this civil war, Abner betrayed Mephibosheth, and he came over to David. And the kingdom was united, and David became king of all Israel. And our time is running short. We don't have time to talk about all the things about David. David became king, and he served God very faithfully in the early part of his reign. But as he defeated his enemies and as he settled into a life of peace, he fell into temptation. One area that David had a weakness for was women. And David had a total of 8 wives who had at least 20 children. We don't know the names of all of them. But David liked women. And one evening, as he was on the top of his palace, looking over the city, he saw a woman bathing on the roof of a nearby palace, and she was very beautiful. And so David wanted to find out who she was, and he sent for her. And she turned out to be the wife of one of his officers. But David did not let that stop him, and they had an affair. And later, when she became pregnant, David decided he needed a plan to cover up his sin. And his kingdom was at war at that time, and he had the husband sent out to fight and ordered that Joab put him into the most dangerous area and then withdraw so that he would die. And that's what happened. Uriah the Hittite, he died fighting for the king. His death arranged by David with Joab's assistance. And David thought everything was going to be okay then. You know, the husband was dead. Shortly after the death was announced, he took Bathsheba and married her, made her his wife, and thought, okay, everything is cool. But it was not. God knew about it, and God revealed this to Nathan and sent Nathan the prophet to rebuke David and to tell him of what would happen. And so the child that was born, or to be born, died. That baby died. And David himself did not suffer any immediate penalties. The normal penalty for adultery was death, but he was the king. So he escaped that penalty. And God did not directly punish him through any other things like sickness or illness. But the ramifications and of what happened reverberated around the palace and within David's family. And in the years that followed, David faced several different rebellions from sons. His oldest son, then later Absalom, the most famous, and on his deathbed, Adonijah, who was next to be in line, or thought he was next in line. And these rebellions, these rising against David by his sons, was a consequence of his adultery with Bathsheba and of the infighting between the various elements within his family. And so, while David was called a man after God's own heart, he was not a perfect man. He repented of his sin of adultery, and he accepted rebuke from God and the punishment that God declared would come against him. So unlike Saul, who resisted and ignored God's rebuke and punishment, David was humble and accepting of the consequences that would come. Whatever God declared, he was willing to accept. And so in his old age, and in his declining years, he suffered a lot of sadness and heartache through these various rebellions of his sons. And in the case of Absalom, it was the extreme of the army being raised against him and him having to flee Jerusalem and the country being at war and Absalom being put to death by Joab. When we think of David and look at his life, we can see that he was a man of action, a man of strong faith. He did not ever question what God commanded him to do. In each of the stories that we read about him, wherever the Spirit guided him, he followed. He made his mistakes, but when those mistakes came to light, when they were pointed out, he accepted God's rebuke and the punishment that came upon him. He did not steer away from or avoid. David was more than just a king, he was also a prophet. Half of the book of Psalms were psalms composed by David. Many of the prophecies related to the Messiah are found in Psalms, and those were psalms composed by David. And so David was a prophet prophesying about the coming of the Messiah and what the Messiah would be like. When we look at David and his life, we see the life of a man who allowed God to use him, and even in his mistakes, learned from those mistakes and picked himself up and placed his trust back in God, regardless of the consequences that came to himself. And so I hope that each day in our own lives that we will be the same as David, that when we slip and we fall, we don't use those as excuses to turn away from God or to ignore or to be angry at the consequences that come from our mistakes. Learning to accept the consequences of bad choices and live with those and realize that those results are because of our bad choices is an important part of Christian life and of our walk with God. We are going to make mistakes every day, and there are going to be consequences that come. But we must accept those consequences and realize that even when bad things happen to us because of our bad choices, God is not turning away from us, and God wants us to walk with Him. And so each day we need to rededicate ourselves to God and reach out for Him again, just as David did.
Thank you for the sermon. To close our worship, let's open our hymnal, page 249, 249. Praise Him, praise Him.